Resident Evil Village is a game that needs to be re-evaluated and elaborated on in a remade retrospective that has better quality to the commentary, additional features to the video, new insights and context gained from Resident Evil 4 Remake that have affected my views on certain parts of Resident Evil Village, additional time devoted to parts that I didn't elaborate on in the first retrospective, an updated understanding with regards to certain lore details like with the BSAA's corruption, and some corrections to points I made in the first retrospective. While Resident Evil Village may have a lot of confusing storytelling moments, this is a game that's incredibly fun and far better than I gave it credit for initially. For those that don't know, Resident Evil Village was the very first game I ever did a retrospective for, and the learning curve definitely showed, as certain parts of the retrospective reflected my inexperience, resulting in a few low-quality elements like with the slow pace of the commentary, the lack of complex editing, a very monotone voice on my part that was present for a lot of the retrospective, and other things that kind of detracted from the points I was trying to address. Also, I didn't quite grasp the proper structuring to the retrospective, which was something that I definitely rectified a bit with my Shadows of Rose DLC retrospective, and then further improved massively with my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective. Creating that retrospective, which was about 17 hours long, provided me with the right amount of editing experience and technical knowledge, and it's a retrospective that I'm very proud to show on my channel. However, because of this massive undertaking with that retrospective, as well as with YouTuber Lasers remaking his Assassin's Creed 2 retrospective, the nagging sensation of updating my Resident Evil Village retrospective was gradually prodding at me. And while I was previously going to do a Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective, the desire to do so changed after I replayed Resident Evil 2 OG after a very long time and found many issues with the game. Talking about both Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake from a story, characters, and gameplay context, in as detailed a manner to what I did in my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective with talking about both Resident Evil 4 OG, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and other relevant Resident Evil media felt a lot more difficult to me when I played it out in my head. And that's not even mentioning the 4 scenario design, the additional lore in the supplementary material, and the confusion regarding certain canon moments. This analysis paralysis led me to feel that a Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective would take far longer to do and be more complicated than my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective. So because of this, and also due to Resident Evil Requiem being announced, which would likely use lore points from Resident Evil 7 and Village, I decided to instead remake my Resident Evil Village retrospective. And it feels like the right time given that Resident Evil Village will be 5 years old in 2026. So like I did previously, I will guide you from start to finish and go into a lot of detail regarding the story, characters, gameplay, screenplay, and writing, and not just the main game, but also with the Shadows of Rose DLC. I'll also talk about any other relevant Resident Evil media when possible. With all that said, let's get into this much needed remake of my first retrospective. So before you start Resident Evil Village, you have the chance to get a recap of Resident Evil 7's events from Ethan's perspective as he's talking with the BSAA. This recap only covers the main game and not the DLCs. It's decent, but there are some confusing moments. For one thing, the part where Ethan says he treated me as symptoms with the serum derived from the D-type mutamycete can come across like new Capcom is saying the serum is the actual cure, but it isn't. However, because he says he treated me as symptoms instead of saying he cured her, that probably makes sense. Also, I don't know why Zoe isn't mentioned by Ethan in this recap. Zoe helped him get the ingredients for the serum, and she created the Baker incident report. Ethan even asked Chris Redfield and his men to search for Zoe after he was rescued by them, which took weeks before Zoe was rescued, so it's odd that she's not mentioned. I'm guessing this interview takes place before the events at the end of Zoe DLC, or the developers didn't see the need to include Zoe in this recap. Either way, it's a bit odd for me. But at the start of the game, we're greeted with a visual representation of a children's book called Village of Shadows, which is narrated by Miranda, who is masquerading as Mia at this point in time. The events described in the book slightly mirror the path the game's story goes on, which I know confuses some people, but it doesn't bother me. This is simply a moment where you have to suspend your disbelief and just take in the tone and ambiance of this book, since the game treats this more so as a meta game element than something that is directly related to story events in Resident Evil Village, even if Miranda tries to say that the book was obtained from a local store and that it's retelling a traditional local tale when she's probably lying. It's an interesting introduction to the game as it's meant to piggyback off the dark atmosphere and tone of the game with its art style. Bioterrorism and occultism are two pieces of iconography that Resident Evil Village blends together in many parts of the game, so new Capcom wanted to favor an occultic aesthetic that subverts the player's expectations and represents the way Miranda is reading to Rose in a more creative manner that introduces Rose as a central character. It's a better introduction to the game compared to that truck driver eating a burger in Resident Evil 2 Remake or that random girl being sacrificed at the start of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Both of these scenes don't serve a purpose and don't enhance the atmosphere or story of their respective titles. They just serve as jarring introductions to these titles, whereas this beginning with the children's book isn't jarring based on the previous reasons I discussed. I also like the way Katie O'Hagan narrates the book, as she does it with more charisma and passion like a parent would, compared to the voice actor who handled the narration when you view the children's book from the extras menu. Also, I don't know why, but the concept art says that Rose's parents used to read her this book, but Mia never read the book to Rose, and Ethan didn't seem familiar with the book when Miranda read it to Rose, so why the concept art says this is unclear. I assume this statement relates to an early draft and not the final version, because there's another concept art that shows Mia reading the book while in a wheelchair, but you'd think they would clarify that they meant the early draft and not the final version. But the book mentions that a young girl went with her mother to pick berries for her father who was hard at work, and in her determination, she separated from her mother and vanished into the forest, which is probably meant to parallel Rose's abduction by Chris or Miranda. She then felt strange eyes upon her and recalled her mother's scary bedtime stories, which caused her throat to become bone dry. This then prompts the Batlord to offer her blood by biting his wing, which mirrors Alcina Dimitrescu's craving for blood, her nurturing of her children through giving them blood, her blood disease, and also how the developers were inspired by Dracula when designing Alcina and her daughters. If you're wondering why Alcina is represented as a bat despite becoming on par with a dragon as part of her mutation, it's because the name Dracula also means child of dragon, so Alcina satisfies both bat and dragon iconography. You can also see 3 bats near the Batlord, which represents Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela. The girl then passed through a graveyard and was freezing, which caused the Dark Weaver to appear and conjure a dress out of mist. The conjuring of the dress out of mist is meant to represent Donna Beneviento's ability to induce hallucinations through plants infected with the mutamycete, and the dress itself is probably meant to represent Donna being a doll maker. Attempting to use a boat to get back home, the girl felt hungry, which prompted the Fish King to give one of his fins. The only form of symbolism here is that the Fish Lord is literally what Salvatore Moreau looks like in his final form. I guess Moreau didn't have enough characteristics to himself to be masked more in a figurative sense within this book, which complements how he's considered the worst of the lords. The girl then entered the dark heart of the forest and found an iron steed wearing a golden gear. Having already been given gifts without any form of request from the other monsters, she assumed it would be no different with this iron steed and snatched the golden gear, which angered the iron steed and caused it to summon the other monsters. The iron steed is of course a symbol of automation, which is related to Heisenberg's use of machinery. The iron steed being angry is related to Heisenberg's own hatred for Miranda and his desire to use Rose's abilities for his own purposes. And I assume the iron steed being in the forest's dark heart represents Heisenberg being the final obstacle before Miranda, and potentially the part where Ethan gets his heart ripped out by Miranda directly after Heisenberg's boss fight. As for the iron steed summoning the other monsters, I assume this is related to Heisenberg being more favorable as a vessel for Ava than the other lords, and also due to Heisenberg being considered more dangerous than the other lords, at least when you go off the English localization of the game. With the monsters ganging up on her, they then disappeared and a dark yet regal witch appeared with crows encircling her. She accused the girl of being given gifts yet taking more than necessary before trapping the girl in a mirror. The dark and regal nature to this witch represents how Miranda controlled the villagers through superstition and how she is viewed as a goddess by the villagers. The crows refer to not only her ability to transform into any organism sampled by the megamycete, but possibly to her ability to surveil the villagers as crows. As for the use of the phrase, gifts we gave but more you took, so more in turn is due, this one is really abstract and I'm not really sure what this is related to. I assume this is related to Miranda's experiments with trying to find the perfect vessel for Ava's consciousness and how Miranda was involved in the creation of Evelyn, and it's through the creation of Evelyn that a series of events were set up that led to Rose being an eventual successor to Evelyn in Miranda's mind, so gifts we gave probably relates to this. As for the more you took part of the quote, this is probably related to Rose's autonomy and identity, as well as how she's considered powerful by the lords. And with more in turn is due, this is probably meant to relate to Miranda's possessiveness over Rose's body, and how she wants to imprint Ava's consciousness onto Rose, wiping out Rose's autonomy and identity. She also says something similar at the end of the game. That's all I can think of with this entire quote, or maybe this entire quote is related to Rose being separated into 4 different crystallized body parts in 4 different flasks. The girl being trapped inside a mirror relates to how Miranda views Rose as nothing more than a reflection of Ava instead of an individual. She's also trapped in the mirror while a full moon is shown, and the finale of the game takes place under a full moon as well. This concludes the parts of the book that are shown in this introduction, and we transition to the start of Ethan's house when he's in the process of taking Rose to bed. As I enunciated before in my first retrospective, being back playing as Ethan Winters was a wholesome moment for me, as he truly feels like a legend in the Resident Evil series, based on the fact that he's really the only video game character that truly feels like a normal individual with no fighting experience. Other game series may want to proclaim that they have normal individuals as characters, but they often try to portray them as grotesquely incompetent in the way their gameplay works, and incapable of performing the simplest of actions readily afforded to us, which is a standard trope in survival horror games when it comes to normal individuals with no fighting experience. It just makes them not feel human in the same way Ethan Winters characters is portrayed. I mean, in Resident Evil 1, you're playing as police officers that are part of a special unit, yet they're incredibly sluggish, have rigid movement, and can't exactly handle firearms or perform more fluid motions to handle such basic enemies like slow-moving zombies. It was something that took me out of the experience, and it made me wonder why the developers opted for police officers as the main characters. Ethan Winters, on the other hand, feels far more competent in combat compared to those characters, and is not limited by such arbitrary barriers. He represents a massive departure from that tiresome trope, and it adds a greater sense of relatability between myself and him, whilst also contributing to a sense of intrigue as to who he was. In the latter case, I never really got that with other Resident Evil characters back then, like with Joe Valentine, Barry Burton, Billy Cohen, or Hunk. Morimasa Sato, the director of Resident Evil Village, would agree with me, as he said he felt attached to Ethan Winters, which is why he wanted to focus on Ethan for Resident Evil Village. Ethan's ordeal during Resident Evil 7 was one of the most engaging experiences I have ever gone through in the Resident Evil series, and it's an experience that changed my entire perspective on how to look at characters. It's a lot to describe, and it's best reserved for another retrospective. And then with Resident Evil Village, it's actually become my most replayed Resident Evil title in the series. You can definitely tell the Winters duology is a very special part of Resident Evil for me. Once we assume control of Ethan, we have the chance to explore his house. Now, in my first retrospective, I didn't spend much time talking about this section, which was a mistake, as there were some things to go over. So obviously the first thing is that Ethan and Mia were relocated to Romania because the Connections, which is the criminal syndicate that Mia used to work for back in Resident Evil 7, are after them. They also assumed new identities, just like when Zoe Baker was allowed to leave the BSAA. The second thing is that you can open a drawer and find some jazz music that was actually composed by Alcina Domitrescu, since she's not from the village despite being of a noble bloodline. She probably made this before 1984, since that's the year Ethan was born, and this was a jazz album he couldn't have listened to when he was young. The Resident Evil podcast team believed that this jazz album was made in the 1940s. Apparently her music wasn't that good, as Ethan acknowledges, which was probably one of the factors that led her to go back to the village. There's also a note from Mia regarding Rose's food, and she stresses not giving mushrooms to Rose, which likely stems from the trauma she endured from being infected by the E-type butamycete and also from the Baker family. Ethan says as much when telling Rose that she doesn't want to remember the incident, and you can also find her medication in a bathroom. The developers even had plans to put Mia in a wheelchair to show she was still recovering from the Baker incident in an early draft. There's also a picture of Mia and Rose that was taken on February 2nd, 2021, which is Rose's half-birthday, meaning that Rose was born on August 2nd, 2020. This same picture was also sent to Zoe by Mia through a mutual contact within the BSAA as a way for Mia to update Zoe and also to thank Zoe for helping them escape the Baker estate. We also find the baby food that Rose eats, which is made by another pharmaceutical company called Horn of Plenty. This company is actually facing financial difficulties in 2020 based on a newspaper you find, so if they're supposedly corrupt, as we've come to expect from most of the pharmaceutical companies in Resident Evil, I doubt they'd measure up to the dubious companies mentioned in Resident Evil Umbrella Corps. A Mr. Everywhere head from Resident Evil 7 appears as a meta-game element, and we find a book from George Trevor that provides a historical look into the architecture of Eastern European castles and keeps. The Resident Evil podcast team believe that George Trevor wrote this book sometime in the 50s or early 60s before he started working on the Arklay Mansion from Resident Evil 1, which he would finish constructing in the summer of 1967. We also get to see a news report on the Baker incident that shows how it was covered up, which I somehow didn't talk about in my first retrospective. The Japanese version of this news report is more detailed, so I'll talk about that. The Resident Evil podcast team claimed that this news report was created on April 18, 2018. Now, I'm a bit hesitant to believe this since the Japanese text I got from the Resident Evil wiki and then translated doesn't mention April or 2018. The Resident Evil podcast team insists that when they looked at the Japanese text, April 18th was mentioned but not 2018, so I'm not sure if the text I looked at on the Resident Evil wiki is incorrect. But strangely, another fan group named Project Umbrella also mentioned April 18th, yet their Japanese text only mentions the 18th and not April, just like with the Resident Evil wiki. However, they didn't acknowledge in their translation that this news report was made in 2018, so I have no idea where both fan groups are getting April 18th from. It's really confusing, but this news report claims that the Accident Investigation Committee officially announced the cause of the missing victims to be due to a toxic gas leak resulting from a natural eruption of fumes from an underground mudstone formation. A news report from the Dolby Daily on July 30th, 2017 alleges that the fumes were a hydrogen sulfide gas, and with the local area being surrounded by wetlands combined with pollution, this would have led to a toxic gas buildup. The news report also mentions that the Baker family, not including Zoe, Deputy Dave Anderson, and the Newsgators crew were killed, but this news report only mentions that a 57-year-old Jack Baker and his family were killed by the gas, and the whereabouts of Ethan and Mia were unknown. The area around the Baker estate was closed off by a quarantine wall set up by Blue Umbrella, which we see in the End of Zoe DLC in Resident Evil 7, it would not be lifted for at least 10 years. Obviously, this is a pretty poor cover-up by the BSAA, and there's not even any mention of the other victims that became molded or what happened to their bodies if they simply died from toxic gas. Alyssa Ashcroft even covered the Baker family victims in a newspaper article from January 19, 2016. I'm surprised she wasn't mentioned in the Baker incident report if her daughter is the main character of Resident Evil Requiem. Some people even posted to social media on July 30th, 2017 that they saw the soldiers' helicopters, a molded and a satellite photo of the SS Annabelle's wreckage. In early August 2017, a professor at Minden University mentioned that hydrogen sulfide builds up in areas where there's a lot of volcanic activity, which Dalby doesn't have. But unfortunately, in the realm of politics, it doesn't matter how much evidence or objective material there is. Those in power can easily brush aside such evidence to the contrary, especially with the BSAA being backed by the United Nations. And remember that with the Raccoon City trials, they went on from 1998 to 2003 due to Spencer's political manipulation counteracting a lot of the evidence against Umbrella and also the testimonies from survivors, like the characters in Resident Evil Outbreak. It was only when Wesker testified anonymously and utilized the data he stole from Umbrella's Caucasus laboratory that he was able to help in bringing down Umbrella. Sadly, there's nothing like that with the Baker incident cover-up, and Ethan acknowledges that everyone has forgotten about the Baker incident aside from Zoe Baker, who honestly should have been the main character of Resident Evil Requiem compared to Grace Ashcroft, but I'll talk about that later on. In fact, I'm surprised people forgot about the Baker incident since they still had memorials for the Raccoon City victims, and the Terra Grigia panic, the Landshine incident, and the New York incident were big bioterror attacks. But then again, Ethan's probably offering an overgeneralization of his perspectives on the aftermath of the incident. Entering Ethan's study, we find a medical checkup report on Rose that was done on Thursday, January 28, 2021 by the BSAA Europe Medical Division. It describes some general characteristics of Rose and also notes that the results of the additional fungal pathogen tests will be provided by the BSAA. Based on this report, there weren't any indications of Rose being born with mutamycete in her body, but this also doesn't show any evidence related to Rose being a perfect adapter to the mutamycete. And with Resident Evil Village making the confusing decision to say that Ethan died at the guest house of the Baker estate and was brought back to life by the E-type mutamycete with his entire body made out of mutamycete as well as with his mutamycete infection allowing him to replicate human cellular tissue and allow the coapting of limbs, it's possibly because of this that Rose is able to serve as the perfect adapter to the mutamycete and be better than Evelyn. There's also a diary entry made by Ethan on Saturday, February 6, 2021, which talks about a fight that he had with Mia when he brought up the Baker incident. Having finally settled down in Romania, they can bring up Rose properly, but the Baker incident is still plaguing Ethan's mind as intrusive memories, and he feels that properly confronting what happened will allow himself and Mia to move on. Now, I know I mentioned in the first retrospective that I found confusion with why Ethan keeps pressing Mia to confront the traumas of the Baker incident together, since the ending of Resident Evil 7 made it seem like Ethan was willing to grant Mia her wish to put the entire incident behind them, but after hearing my subscribers critique this point I made and also thinking about it more closely, I don't hold that same confusion now. So it's actually logical that the Baker incident would still be present as intrusive memories in Ethan's mind. Also, in the final couple of sentences, Ethan acknowledged the prior fight he had with Mia on Thursday, February 4, 2021, since they went to the hospital to talk about Rose's results. The reason why that particular fight occurred was because of Mia trying to keep the truth regarding Ethan being made entirely out of mutamycete hidden. She was afraid that any analysis of Rose would lead to Ethan discovering the truth about himself. As such, Ethan mistakenly believed that Mia's outburst at the hospital was related to Rose and the Baker incident rather than the truth about himself. Now is not the right time to talk about the confusion involved with how Mia even knew about Ethan being made out of mutamycete or the confusing logic behind her hiding the truth. I'll talk about those points later on. But speaking of hidden truths, there's something I need to address with regards to Mia's former status as an operative for the Connections. In Resident Evil 7, just before the SS Annabelle had crashed on October 5th, 2014, Mia sent a video message to Ethan saying that she did lie to Ethan and that she shouldn't have done so, which alludes to her lying about her role as an operative working for the Connections. The Kaitai Shinso for Resident Evil 7 mentions that Mia's job cover was that she worked for a trading company and she would often leave for long periods of time while traveling abroad, which put a strain on her relationship with Ethan. This would of course lead to Ethan developing suspicions about Mia. Then, after Mutated Jack's boss fight, as Ethan and Mia attempt to escape the Baker estate via boat, Ethan questions if Mia was involved in some way with what happened at the Baker estate and asks for the truth, which shows that he had suspicions about her criminal status. But for some reason, in the Baker incident report and the main experience for Resident Evil Village, Ethan acts like he never had suspicions about Mia's occupation. It's like Resident Evil Village's developers completely forgot about the scenes that occurred in Resident Evil 7. Furthermore, in an interview with the BSAA, Mia had asked that the BSAA disclosed her involvement with the Connections to Ethan, to which they said they didn't. But it shouldn't be possible for this interview to exist if Ethan already had a slight confirmation of her criminal status. Because of this, it doesn't feel like the beliefs and personalities given to Ethan in Resident Evil Village branch out logically from how he was at the end of Resident Evil 7. But after looking over these files, we find a gun survivalist manual from Joseph Kendo related to heavy firearms and field combat situations. Joseph Kendo is actually Blue Umbrella's chief of weapons development, and his designs on the Samurai Edge combined with Albert Wesker's secret research were used by Blue Umbrella to develop the Alberto 1 from Resident Evil 7. We also see a picture book related to Ethan's marriage to Mia and Rose's birth, with Ethan remarking that he wishes he could stay like this forever. This is one of my favorite lines because every time I hear this line, I think back to what Ethan said in Resident Evil 7 where he said, "Now, I've seen everything." I'd like to think New Capcom was referencing that line when they made Ethan say this in order to show how much he wishes for a quiet life after going through the craziness he went through in Resident Evil 7. And as he's walking back to Rose's crib, he jokes to Rose that Mia is scary when she's angry, which not only relates back to the prior fights he's had with Mia, but also the time when Mia attacked Ethan while under Evelyn's influence in Resident Evil 7, which is quite an amusing line. After putting Rose in her crib, Ethan returns downstairs to have dinner with Miranda. It's worth noting that Miranda likely abducted Mia around February 7th or 8th, since there's a note from Eugene dated February 8, 2021 that mentions he wasn't getting messages from Miranda, and I assume the experiments she conducted on Mia were not only for figuring out how Rose came to be, but also for getting the right genetic data to allow her to transform into Mia, and also gain access to her memories and behaviors. That being said, such experimentation should take longer than the time it takes for Ethan to do his job, assuming it's a regular 9-to-5 job. And I don't know if Ethan has an in-person or remote job, and if he resumed his work as a systems engineer. Furthermore, if Miranda abducted Mia and kept her in a cell in her lab, how exactly did she take Mia there without any transportation? And why were Ethan and Mia relocated to a location so close to Miranda's village if Chris found out about Miranda in either 2017 or 2018 if he's been doing this operation for roughly 3 years? I would assume Chris found out about Miranda in 2018 because assuming Ethan and Mia were relocated to Romania in either August or September of 2017, since the events of Resident Evil 7 take place from July 19, 2017 to August of 2017, if Chris knew about Miranda in 2017, he would have halted or contested the relocation effort. Also, in a report on the connections, it's mentioned that in recent years, the connections have been particularly active in Eastern Europe. So based on this, it wouldn't make sense to relocate Ethan and Mia to Romania. The Resident Evil podcast team had done an interview with Anthony Johnson, the lead screenwriter for Resident Evil Village, and when they asked him about why Ethan and Mia were relocated to an area so close to Miranda and her village and if there was a sinister reason for it, all he said was, "I could not possibly comment," which is not a reassuring comment as it probably relates to Resident Evil Village's troubled development. And regarding the relocation, did the BSAA or Chris Redfield facilitate this? Because later on in this dinner scene, Ethan mentions that Chris moved them here and he also received some military training, but I think when he says that Chris moved them here, he's attributing the BSAA's actions to Chris. It's possible that in actuality, the BSAA intentionally moved Ethan and Mia to Eastern Europe to maybe draw out the connections of Miranda, but the main counter to this point is that they'd have to wait for almost 3 or 4 years for the connections of Miranda to do something if Ethan and Mia were relocated to Romania in August or September of 2017. Also, Miranda had no reason to go after Ethan and Mia if Rose was only born on August 2nd, 2020, and she only found out about Rose when the connections informed her of her existence. The BSAA didn't even know about Miranda around January 2021 based on the warning letter to Chris in the Baker incident report, so the relocation likely isn't related to Miranda. Of course, how the connections found out about Rose is unclear, though it may imply they had a mole in the BSAA, which is not answered unfortunately. And what exactly was Chris doing in the 3 years before the events of Resident Evil Village when it came to Miranda? Why did he wait so long to actually take down Miranda? I get that he has other duties and other potential BOW incidents to deal with, but does he not know where Miranda's village is? I mean, he had Tundra performing recon in order to figure out Miranda's plan with abducting Rose, which is how they found out about Miranda transforming into Mia, but when did all that happen? And you're telling me that during that period, he never thought of evacuating the Winters family from their house so that Miranda couldn't get them? Early drafts of the game had Chris entering the Winters home in civilian clothing, which would have worked in the period before the events of the game, which take place on February 9, 2021, yet they dropped that idea, which doesn't make sense. I already mentioned this in my first retrospective, but the vague storytelling model alongside the trial and error development to Resident Evil Village, likely due in part to COVID and a short deadline, caused many of the story moments to be downright confusing, and this prologue is filled with so much confusion, even the Resident Evil podcast team agrees. But back to this dinner scene, Miranda keeps trying to reassure Ethan everything's alright and disabuse Ethan of his concerns over the Baker incident. point. I'm amazed Miranda is able to maintain this ruse and say these kinds of lines so easily despite only abducting Mia roughly a few days back. I still question the logic and rationale behind her plan to disguise herself. Why go through the effort? If Miranda could easily abduct Mia and take her to her lab in the village, she could easily take Rose from Ethan. I know Chris theorizes in a file later on that maybe Miranda disguised herself as Mia in order to control Rose easier, but in the hive mind moment that Ethan experiences upon depositing a flask, he sees Rose being taken by Miranda, who was not disguised. Also, if Miranda is going to crystallize Rose, divide her into 4 parts, then reconstitute her in the Megamycete regulator as a completely different person entirely, why try to disguise herself as Mia so that Rose trusts her? It doesn't make sense. It's like Miranda believes that Rose already has her abilities, but the game implies that Rose only gained her abilities once Miranda divided her into 4 crystallized parts. Like I said, the screenplay of the prologue is not put together well. Just as Miranda is about to criticize Ethan, she's shot by one of the Hound Wolf Squad members and doesn't flinch, which I can't tell if that's intentional to convey that this isn't Mia, or if this is just an oversight by the developers. An onslaught of bullets are then fired by the Hound Wolf Squad, which subdues Miranda, but almost kills Ethan in the crossfire, and they're still firing even after Miranda is subdued, which I don't understand. Everything about this presents as a confusing methodology for subduing Miranda, and they didn't bother getting Ethan away by using a phone call or by approaching him in civilian clothing. Why would they not do any of those things? The variables for unfavorable outcomes are extremely high with this confusing methodology, which are variables that a skilled leader like Chris Redfield should be avoiding. Upon entering the dining room and confronting Ethan, Chris then shoots Miranda 5 times in the head and assumes she's dead. I didn't talk about this in the first retrospective, but this part here is one of the dumbest moments in the prologue. Every time a Mutamycete BOW dies, they crystallize and then break apart. This didn't happen with Miranda here, yet Chris idiotically assumes she's dead. I have no idea how the developers missed this blatantly obvious point when every time you kill an enemy in this game, they crystallize. And before you cite Resident Evil 7's Molded as not crystallizing when killed, it's likely due to an oversight from the developers, or maybe the Molded worked differently, as they still showed the Baker family crystallizing when killed. The screen then blacks out and an unknown amount of time passes. The Hound Wolf Squad captures Rose and Chris offers no explanation to Ethan regarding the circumstances of what happened. He instead chooses to act secretive like a villain arbitrarily and have his Hound Wolf Squad members knock Ethan out for forceful extraction after Ethan lays a hand on Chris. His reasons for being secretive are that Ethan would want to be involved and his job is hard enough without civilians getting in the way. Also, Chris believed that Ethan may have potentially been infected by Miranda. None of these points make sense because Ethan would have already wanted to be involved if he believed he saw his wife being gunned down in cold blood by Chris's men. The trauma and confusion of such an event would make anyone want to be involved, and saying he didn't want Ethan involved doesn't compliment him believing that Miranda infected Ethan. Secondly, the part where Chris says this job is hard enough doesn't make sense because Chris broke off from the BSAA and went rogue due to the BSAA now being a rotten, ruined organization. He's not fulfilling a job if he's gone rogue, and he's been heavily critical of the BSAA since the Baker incident, due to the BSAA accepting help from Blue Umbrella to counteract new threats and also to alleviate the ballooning operational costs the BSAA has been accruing. The third thing is that Ethan is hardly a civilian, as he went through so many Molded, dealt with the Baker family, and took down Evelyn all on his own. He overcame both biological and psychological elements to the E-type Mutamycete. Ethan's also read the reports made by the Connections regarding the E-type Mutamycete's development in Resident Evil 7. He also received training from Chris Redfield. Nothing about Ethan profiles as a regular civilian. And the part where he believed that Ethan was infected by Miranda doesn't make sense, as he should know about the symptoms associated with Mutamycete infection, and he's been performing recon on Miranda and the Winters family. Ethan's even had tests done on himself by the BSAA that showed no signs of infection. I mean, technically he was infected, but his infection somehow replicated human cells so perfectly that no abnormalities were detected, even though there should have been abnormalities. And is this really how Chris treats seemingly infected individuals who display no outward signs of aggression upon initial contact with others? Like, it's just so unnecessarily aggressive on his part. The number of problems present with this scene only scratch the surface on how much Chris acts so much out of character in this game. Chris Redfield is the worst character in this game, and this version of Chris Redfield is the worst in the entire series. And to talk again about Chris not giving an explanation to Ethan, how could he act like this when back in Resident Evil 6, Chris had no problems with telling Jake that he killed his father, Albert Wesker, in Resident Evil 5. If he had no trouble with this, why would it be different with Ethan? It makes no sense. By the way, did Chris choose to put Ethan and Rose in the same vehicle as Miranda's body? If so, who in their right mind would think that's a good idea? What if some kind of reactionary spreading of the Mutamycete from Miranda's body occurred, which would put Ethan and Rose Rose at risk? Did Chris not consider the possibility of Miranda reviving given his history with dealing with BOWs that don't stay dead easily? And once again, Chris has no reason to assume Miranda is dead if she didn't crystallize and shatter. It's through Chris and his Hound Wolf Squad stupidity that Miranda is able to kill the 2 transport officers, crash the vehicle, and abduct Rose. And based on the way this vehicle looks when inspecting the crash, it makes it seem like Ethan and Rose were placed on a seat right next to Miranda's body, or Miranda's body was on the ground. Do I really need to say more on how this doesn't feel like proper procedure when dealing with an infected subject like Miranda? This is asking for contamination to occur. And what's the point of separating Ethan from Rose in his house if they're going to be together in the same vehicle this close to Miranda? And also, Site C, which is the location the vehicle was originally supposed to go to before crashing, is incredibly close to the village. I get that they would set up Site C close to the village in order to deal with Miranda quickly after the necessary recon, but why take Ethan and Rose to that location if Chris doesn't want Ethan to get involved and Miranda and the other lords are trying to abduct Rose? Is Chris literally trying to aid Miranda's plan? I mean, this is so stupid. And for a rogue unit, I'm amazed they have plenty of resources to set up a site and also deal with a large amount of BOWs. Where are they getting their resources? None of this makes any sense. But after Ethan gets knocked out, he's taken by Chris's men en route to Site C. While Ethan is knocked out, we see a flashback that took place on either January 28th or January 29th, 2021, after Applefeld Memorial Hospital received Rose's results from the BSAA Europe Medical Division. Ethan receives a phone call from the hospital. I'm surprised this person on the line is referring to Ethan as Mr. Winters if the Winters family had their identities changed. Ethan concludes the call and tries to assure an agitated Mia that Rose will be fine, but Mia's paranoia is not based around Rose but around Ethan, as she's worried that whatever they find on Rose may lead to the truth about Ethan being revealed. Of course, her agitated state nearly caused her to reveal the truth about Ethan here, but fortunately, Ethan gets a phone call from work that cuts the conversation short. At least they return to their normal emotional states the following day since they were preparing for Rose's half-birthday. I assume the whole point of this flashback is to gradually introduce the player to the secondary story point regarding Ethan being made out of the Mutamycete, even though once again, Mia's logic and reasoning behind keeping this a secret and how she even knew about this point on Ethan are confusing. Ethan then awakens from the crash, and based on the clock in his house that's right by the TV, Ethan was taken from his house right around 7:34 p.m. on February 8, 2021. He also awoke from the crash at dawn on February 9, 2021, which I would say is around 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. The Resident Evil podcast team believed that Ethan awoke around 7:40 a.m., so roughly half a day passed, and in that interim, Miranda crashed the transport and took Rose while leaving Ethan unconscious. The Lycans also laid waste to the village, and the Resident Evil podcast team believed that the Lycans performed stealth raids on the village while Miranda was disguised as Mia on either February 7th or 8th, and then when Miranda took Rose from the crash, she ordered the Lycans to lay waste to the village, likely as a form of sacrifice to the Megamycete to prepare for the ceremony. As for leaving Ethan unconscious in the snow, I'm surprised she would do that when she abducted Mia and used her in experiments. I guess she was in a rush to abduct Rose at that moment and didn't think about Ethan, and maybe her plans for testing and observing Ethan to figure out how Rose came to be, and also to potentially use him to eliminate the other lords, were only made after he arrived in the village. I really have no idea. As for the wreckage being so close to the village, this is likely related to Site C being so close to the village as well for some reason. Ethan makes brief contact with some kind of commanding officer who asks if Rose was secured, and when this officer realizes it wasn't one of the soldiers who received the call, he says this is a secure channel and that Ethan isn't authorized to answer, but the call is cut out. This part confuses me because it makes it seem like this commanding officer is working officially and not unofficially. If Chris is in command of a rogue unit, then it wouldn't make sense for this commanding officer to talk about secure channels and authorization. It makes it come across like the idea of Chris acting like a villain and being in charge of a rogue unit was only decided at the last moment, despite Anthony Johnson saying that making the BSAA evil was always the goal for this game. I'll talk more about the BSAA being a corrupt organization when I get to Chris's section, because while I did say in my first retrospective that the BSAA being evil made no sense, it's actually a point that is complemented by prior Resident Evil media, like Resident Evil 5, Revelation, 6, and Vendetta. Ethan then treks through the forest to find Rose. During this trek, you can find dead fish, which is a reference to Resident Evil 7, since the Mutamycete is particularly toxic to fish. This is probably due to the way the fish extract oxygen directly from water through their gills, the delicate ion balance systems with them, the relatively simple immune system they have, and the fact that fish are ectothermic, so their metabolism depends on stable water temperatures. Because of these factors, the fish likely die from toxic shock, immune collapse, or metabolic failure compared to other larger organisms like the alligators from the End of Zoe DLC. I do find it interesting how, despite fish being extremely extremely vulnerable to the mutamycete, Moreau's mutation is based around fish. I can't tell if there's supposed to be a lore reason for this, or if this is just a metagame element from the developers where they're wanting the player to view Moreau as the worst lord based on the fact that his mutation is based around fish, which die from mutamycete exposure. I get that the fish's vulnerability to the mutamycete is likely related to biology with the way their bodily systems respond to the environment rather than genetics, and in the case of Moreau, he's a human with fish traits, but it still seems odd that Miranda would try to perform such an experiment if it's pretty easy to figure out that fish die easily from the mutamycete. Her extreme maternal instincts wouldn't allow a vessel to be made from a Cadou being given fish DNA. The thing is, I can't tell if the reason why Moreau's human form is more malformed is due to his low Cadou affinity, his psychological state, or because his Cadou initially absorbed fish and amphibian DNA prior to it being implanted in him. It's a lot to elaborate on right now, so I'll talk about it later. After Ethan explores a house and the sun rises, he's able to get to the village, which to this day still looks amazing. And after playing Resident Evil 4 Remilk with its rather dull look to its village, it only serves to make me appreciate this game's village even more. The level of detail that went into this village, from the rural and non-contemporary architecture, the amount of clutter in objects and rooms in the environment, the hanging pots, the way the environment feels lost to time and also laid to waste by the Lycans and the Lords. It's truly impressive and helps in establishing the village as its own character in that sense. Say what you will about the Ethan Winters-based Resident Evil games, but they truly have the best environments in the entire series. The attention to detail and the way they're able to make such impressive looking environments without relying upon arcadey designs as easy backups like the older Resident Evil games did are incredible. And I can't help but feel like the use of the first person perspective is a minor factor to consider with the attention to detail. After trekking through this part of the village and wondering what happened to everyone, Ethan enters a house, gets blocked in by debris, finds a kitchen knife, and encounters Grigori. Grigori's reactive gunshot draws the attention of the Lycans, and in his panic, he gives Ethan the Lemmy pistol for defending themselves. Ethan sounds more calm than Grigori. Grigori is then killed by being pulled through the ceiling by a Lycan, and then this is where the cutscene displays a confusing cut, almost like there was a part of the cutscene they forgot to include. For some reason, Ethan is teleported back to the part of the room where he got the kitchen knife and then pulled under the floor by a Lycan. The Lycan then retreats for some reason, and Ethan discovers a bunch of bodies piled up under the floor, possibly as a feeding ground for the Lycans or maybe as a sacrificial site for the Megamycete. Having already gone through the Baker incident, Ethan isn't as disturbed by the bodies as others would be, but he still questions what's going on in this village. He then sees a pulsating body or maybe a Lycan simply remaining where it is before he's surprised by another one that bites off his pinky and ring finger. Another confusing cut is then shown with this cutscene. For some reason, despite there not being a wooden wall behind Ethan, when the Lycan throws him, he's magically teleported back to the other room where Grigori died and thrown through the wooden wall of that room. The weird cuts in the middle of this cutscene are so glaring, and the thing is, they already had a cutscene available for the part where Ethan was thrown through the wooden wall. In the visual development of Resident Evil Village video, the cutscene for this moment shows Ethan narrowly avoiding a Lycan's weapon before being tossed through the wooden wall, so why did they decide at the last moment to change the cutscene? It's such a strange decision. After that little moment, Ethan gets to a barn and is beset upon by Lycans. One thing I find strange is the lack of a typewriter before getting to the barn. Given that the upcoming attack by the Lycans is a pretty big section, I don't understand why new Capcom didn't bother giving players the chance to make a save and practice this section properly without having to go through the introduction. They instead placed the first typewriter in the church where there are hardly any enemies in the fields and fighting them isn't practical. And the first typewriter is placed so close to the typewriter that's in Louisa's house. Why even place a typewriter in Louisa's house when it's before a cutscene and there are no enemies once you exit Louisa's house? It makes no logical sense. But back to the barn encounter, this part is misleading for your first playthrough because it makes it seem like multiple Lycans are after you when you only have to deal with one Lycan that has no weapons and only grabs. The game really stresses upon you using your knife to deal with this Lycan since it has more life than usual, it has no weapons, and pistol bullets are crucial to surviving the upcoming Lycan siege. You have two ways to deal with this Lycan. The first way is by strafing away from its grab, then knifing it twice during its recovery frames while minding your surroundings. The second way, which is the method I prefer, involves utilizing a mechanic that the game doesn't tell you about but is only really worth using for this encounter. So I didn't discuss this in my first retrospective given that I didn't see the point in it at the time, but there is a unique counter against the Lycans where if you hit them in the head at the right moment before their attack makes contact with you, you will trigger a flinch animation that will prompt the Lycan to perform a lunging grab. When it grabs you, if you press the guard button, you will kick the Lycan away and avoid taking damage entirely. The way this mechanic is implemented makes it only feasible when dealing with one Lycan because the time between triggering the flinch animation and getting grabbed is quite lengthy, lengthy, which can allow other Lycans to attack you in that interval. By the way, you do get iframes while you're in the middle of the grab animation, and for a brief time after you kick the Lycan away, other enemies will not attack you, but again, it's completely pointless for the rest of the game, as you have far better options for dealing with the Lycans. Worse yet, the programming for this counter mechanic is atrocious, because the flinch animation only triggers when Ethan and the Lycan are standing at the same elevation, or when Ethan is lower in elevation compared to the Lycan. For example, if you're on a staircase, you need to be below the Lycan for the counter to trigger. If you're above the Lycan, even when you time your hit correctly, you will not get the counter. I've never heard of a game locking out a counter animation simply because you're a few inches higher in relation to the enemy, and it's a counter dependent on a hit to the head. It makes no sense why the programming is this bad. Even the slightest change in elevation is enough to lock you out of the counter, which is why there are moments where even if you're standing on a surface that looks perfectly flat to you, the game might not recognize that it's flat, so it may deny you the counter in that moment. It's really dumb that that's the case. Also, for some reason, the Lycan's minimum HP increases to 1 whenever they're staggering from the kick, so you can't kill them while they're in that period of time. And since this is the only time you'll be using the knife against an enemy in this game, it's worth mentioning that the knife mechanics of this game are really dumb, because you can't knife continuously like in the other Resident Evil games. If you knife twice, you'll suddenly have to wait for an arbitrary amount of time to be able to knife again. It's one of the most illogical and downright confusing designs for a knife in a Resident Evil title, and it feels like bad programming or an oversight. In order to bypass this stupid design, after you do the 2 knife slashes, you have to press the guard button to cancel out the arbitrary interval and be able to knife again. An unnecessary artificial step in the knife's functions, just to make it work in a similar manner to the old games. Such abnormal thinking. And by the way, the directional knife slashes in Resident Evil Village aren't programmed correctly compared to Resident Evil 7. In Resident Evil 7, if you turn the camera to the left, Ethan would logically slash from right to left, and if you turned it to the right, he'd slash from left to right, matching the direction of the movement. But in Resident Evil Village, it's the other way around. Turning the camera left causes Ethan to slash from left to right, and turning it right makes him slash from right to left. How did they accidentally change the programming for the directional knife slashes? It makes no sense. While it may seem minor, it can, in very rare instances, become an issue in this section, as the right to left slash is slightly more accurate than the left to right one, given that Ethan is knifing slightly downward, which is more preferable for hitting the Lycan's head. Another mechanic we're talking about that is actually useful is that this game inherits the sprint counter system from Resident Evil 4, where the enemies will prematurely start an attack early if they detect you sprinting at them. The Lycans in Morieka have this mechanic of punishing you for sprinting, which can be helpful for baiting out attacks. Other enemies like the Soldats, however, will do a lightning fast attack to punish you for sprinting, which makes it crucial to avoid triggering their sprint counters unnecessarily. But back to this section, after you pick up the pistol ammo up top and then the pistol ammo on the bottom, the Lycan will spawn. You need to stay on the bottom level, sprint into him to bait out his grab, then when he tries to grab again, hit his head to trigger the counter, knife him a bit before he grabs you, then kick him away. I usually like to knife him once while he's staggering, then guard cancel to ready my knife. Repeat this process until he dies and you'll get a checkpoint. After hearing a radio message from Louisa requesting any survivors to come to her house, Ethan tries to leave but is surrounded by Lycans, beginning the Lycan siege. Compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake's crappy village intro with its brain-dead enemy designs, clunky mechanics, spammy grab nonsense with the enemies, and improper combat mentalities in relation to that pre-alpha's fundamental mechanics forcing you to game the system and use very weird strategies like using janky stealth and damage rate strategies to satisfy the kill counter for that awful sequence, Resident Evil Village's Lycan siege encounter can be done consistently using 1 barricade and plenty of pistol ammo. Its dark, tense atmosphere is not compromised by poor game design. I mean, the trigger to end the sequence is still quite confusing with why the developers opted for it, where you have to survive for a certain amount of time until all of a sudden a Lycan grabs you from behind or you get an arrow embedded into your leg. Also, it's quite an inconvenience on your first playthrough when you burn through your pistol ammo on the first Lycan, get a checkpoint, and you're unable to get all your ammo back if you don't have enough to start the Lycan siege. At that point, you have to restart the game from the beginning, but that being said, once you grasp the mentalities involved with this section after multiple playthroughs, it's definitely more preferable than Resident Evil 4 Remake's Village intro. This is precisely why I say many times that I replay the weaker parts to a title in order to salvage something positive from them, and I definitely salvaged some positives from this Lycan siege, even if I had to go through frustrating gameplay on many of my initial playthroughs to actually find this consistent method that actually feels intentional from the developers. So upon starting this sequence, you'll want to run for this house, set up the barricade, grab the 10 pistol bullets from here, then start shooting this first Lycan before he busts through. You have plenty of time to hit the Lycan since the barricades can take 11 hits before being destroyed. Time your pistol shots to his head to allow more time to pass through the sequence and to also delay the other Lycans from setting up to destroy the barricade. Once the first Lycan's dead, kill the next Lycan in the same manner. Once the second Lycan's dead, repeat the process. After the first or the second Lycan is dead, you can go for the 5 pistol bullets in this drawer. With the third Lycan that appears, there may be moments where 2 Lycans will phase through each other to perform the direct action of breaking the barricade. Shoot these 2 Lycans and one of the Lycans will resume the direct action while the other will kneel down and start clawing at the barricade even though he's not actually damaging the barricade. That being said, it's important to bear in mind that there can be moments where the kneeling Lycan will damage the barricade. If you see the barricade shaking, you've got to shoot the kneeling Lycan before he destroys the barricade, then resume firing at the Lycan directly damaging the barricade. Once at least 3 Lycans are dead, generally you won't be getting Lycans at the barricade if you remain between the table and the barricade. If they do come, try to hold them off. Try to also make sure that you move around occasionally if you feel the time limit for the sequence has passed, because you need space behind you to trigger the clunky scripted event with the Lycan grabbing you from behind. And in case you're wondering, the Lycans will never think to come through the hole in the floor of this house. They only come through the floor if you leave the house then go back in. If you triggered this Lycan siege by entering this house and you remain in the house, they won't come through the hole. Even if they do somehow bust through the barricade, the shotgun and the flower can help in delaying them for a bit. This pretty much summarizes the strategy for this Lycan siege encounter. I'm still very impressed by the dark tone of this encounter, as you really feel the sense of loneliness with Ethan and how he's one man against an entire army of Lycans. And considering that this is his second time encountering BOWs, the sheer scale and chaos of the situation stands out as far more intense than what the other Resident Evil protagonists have faced their second time fighting BOWs. None of them ever went through a siege section like this, and it makes sense why Ethan would be in this kind of section given that he's on the enemy's turf. I especially like the design of this house, like with the toy train on the bed, as you realize this place used to be a family home and now you're using it to fend off hordes of these villagers that have turned into Lycans. That juxtaposition of childhood iconography with horror iconography is always such a strong mix in these survival horror games, and when coupled with one of the scariest pieces of music in a Resident Evil game, it elevates the atmosphere of this section into something truly unforgettable. The Resident Evil games featuring Ethan Winters will always be the darkest entries of the series. Ethan is subdued by the Lycans and surrounded by them. Lycans on horseback appear, as well as Aureus, the former village chief. Before they can do anything to him, in a manner reminiscent of Resident Evil 4, the castle bell tolls and they retreat. I say this rather tentatively, but maybe it's not just the castle bell, but also Miranda who draws them away, as she maybe wants Ethan alive for a bit so that she can observe him and potentially learn more about how Rose came to be. Either that, or maybe Miranda only relayed this command to Aureus and the Lycans decided to follow his lead. It's odd how Lycans appear on horseback, yet you never see them on horseback again, so I guess it was an idea that was cut out for the later parts. With the Lycans gone, Ethan removes the arrow from his left leg and bandages his left hand. Obviously, because of his infection via the E-type mutamycete, he's able to recover quite easily. He's unfortunately not able to regenerate his fingers, given that he's only able to co-opt limbs and not regrow them, so without finding his fingers, he can't co-opt them back to his hand. I'm not entirely sure why his form of healing is so different from the documented cases of regeneration with the E-type mutamycete. In fact, I find it rather annoying how New Capcom had cutscenes for this village siege where Ethan didn't lose any limbs or have any serious injuries occur, like with that one cutscene where the Lycan threw Ethan through a wall instead of biting his fingers, and also with that other cutscene where the Lycan grabs Ethan from behind to cue the end of the Lycan siege. I don't really understand why there's a lot of incongruity with the flow of cutscenes for this beginning to the village. It's like they couldn't decide what cutscenes to favor or design new cutscenes entirely, and it creates a fragmented and inconsistent narrative flow to the village opening. If they kept the cutscenes where Ethan didn't lose limbs or have serious injuries, a lot less confusion would have resulted.